Let me just begin with a few preliminaries. The first of which is to respectfully acknowledge that the host institution for this talk is located squarely within Wampanoag country. And if there are any Wampanoag audience members on this call, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge their presence too. Let me emphasize, if my surname didn't give it away, I'm not Wampanoag. And this is decidedly not a talk that is from a modern Wampanoag perspective. I'm a historian, and though I respect the oral history of Wampanoag people, the methodologies I use sometimes lead to conclusions that jar with the understandings, the historical understandings of Wampanoag people. And part of what I appreciate in doing public talks like this is the opportunity to talk through the differences between academic history perspectives on some of these subjects and modern living perspectives on some of these topics. I also want to make a note about the terminology that I'll be using during this talk here today. Occasionally, you're going to hear me use the term Indian. And I realize that's a word that's jarring for some people today, who, in an effort to be more racially sensitive, have shifted to the term Native American or Native or Indigenous. The reason I use the term Indian in referring to Indigenous people in the aggregate the way that I do is that most of the Native people I know prefer the term. In other words, they've appropriated this misnomer. We're not in India. I think I can assume that of most of you. They've appropriated the term Indian and made it a point of pride. And so I defer to them in deciding how to refer to them in the aggregate. The point is that my use of the term is out of deference and not indifference. And so with that, the subject of this talk, No Refuge, Colonialism and the Wampanoags of Cape Cod, stems from a conversation that I had with Debbie and Tom, in which they mentioned to me the widespread assumption on the Cape that Cape Cod was the peaceful exception to the violent rule of colonial dispossession of Native people. And I have to be honest, I wasn't the least bit surprised to hear this. I've actually heard this in a number of various locales across the United States over the course of my professional life as a historian. And I was particularly not surprised to hear it from people who lived on the Cape. I mean, after all, the Thanksgiving myth that's associated with Cape Cod would have us believe that friendly Indians, and they're rarely identified by tribe, but that friendly Indians welcomed colonists to their country, shared a meal with them, and then disappeared so that the colonist descendants could found the United States as a Christian democratic beacon of opportunity for the rest of humankind. In other words, that Thanksgiving myth that looms over our understanding of the colonial Indian relations of 17th century New England is a story of bloodless colonialism. And I must acknowledge the notion of a peaceful Cape Cod does have more than a shred of truth to it. The violence of King Philip's War of 1675, which devastated so much of the mainland, didn't spread to Cape Cod or to the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, which is not to say, as we're going to see here today, that the war didn't have profound effects in those places. It most certainly did. Yet the accomplishment of maintaining an uneasy peace during King Philip's War requires explanation. And it requires explanation because many of the exact same tensions in Indian colonial relations that exploded into war on the mainland were indeed present on the Cape and the islands. More to the point, and this will be the thrust of my comments today, focusing too narrowly on the absence of war on the Cape misses the more important point, that the English and their white successors seized the vast majority of land belonging to Native people and reduced Indigenous people to poverty and servitude. Colonialism on the Cape was indeed less bloody than on the adjacent mainland, but over the long term, it was equally effective at achieving the larger colonial agenda of subjugating Native people and appropriating their resources. Coming to terms with this process of death by inches as Mashpee's native minister, William Apis, called it in the 1830s, is essential, I think, to dismantling our country's mythology of benevolent colonialism. And it's essential to forcing us collectively to confront how colonial systematic racism continues to shape our modern society. I think this perspective will also help us to appreciate the remarkable resourcefulness of Wampanoag communities like Mashpee and Aquinnah that managed to survive this multi-pronged assault, this apocalypse, if you will, through constant adaptation and to reemerge as decidedly vibrant, modern Indigenous peoples. Now, the fact that Cape and Island Wampanoags just barely managed to keep the violence of King Philip's War from their neighborhoods couldn't have been predicted by the early hostility of those groups to English colonists. The powerful mainland Wampanoag sachem, or chief, Usamequin, better known to most of us as Massasoit, the leader of the community of Pokanoket, which you can see right here, he wanted to forge a military and trade alliance with the colony of Plymouth in order to fend off the aggressions of the Narragansett people to his west. And the Narragansetts were trying to take advantage at the time of the Mayflower's arrival. They were trying to take advantage of the Wampanoags' devastation by an epidemic disease between 1616 and 1619 and reduce them to the status of tributaries. So in other words, Usamequin or Massasoit is reaching out to Plymouth Colony for an alliance to offset the Narragansetts who are trying to subjugate the Wampanoags. Yet Wampanoags on Cape Cod and the islands opposed Usamequin's strategy. For years before the arrival of the Mayflower, indeed, for decades, they had suffered slave raids, kidnappings, and other violence at the hands of European explorers. They had been in contact with Europeans for a century before the arrival of the Mayflower. And thus, this experience gave them very little reason to believe that the Mayflower passengers would behave any differently from these ne'er-do-wells who had visited their shores. Cape and Island Wampanoags, thus, negotiated with the Massachusetts people to the north and even with the Narragansetts to wipe out Plymouth during its first couple of years. Well, how do we know that? Well, that's what Usamequin told the English. To avoid this outcome, in 1623, Usamequin directed a vicious English strike against the supposed Massachusetts ringleaders of this plot. Those ringleaders lived on the south shore of Massachusetts Bay. This bloody maneuver had the desired effect. It took out the Massachusetts ringleaders, but it also doubled as a warning to Wampanoag dissidents, a warning to Wampanoags who were disenchanted with Usamequin's outreach to Plymouth. The Wampanoags interpreted a simultaneous outbreak of an epidemic on Cape Cod, which killed several leading sachems. I should mention parenthetically, it also killed Squanto, the main interpreter between the Wampanoags and the English. They interpreted this outbreak of the epidemic right on the cusp of this strike against the Massachusetts people as evidence of the colonists' potent spiritual power. And they never conspired against Plymouth or Usamequin again, at least as far as the written record tells us. Instead, and this is a remarkable turn, given this early history of hostility, by the 1640s, Wampanoags on the Cape and the islands had widely decided to seek their own alliance with the English and use it to break free of their tribute obligations to Usamequin or Massasoit. And let me explain how they came to this decision. The balance of power in southern New England shifted dramatically during the 1630s. Some 15,000 Englishmen and women migrated to the new colony of Massachusetts Bay in the space of 10 years. Just to give you a sense of comparison, the first group of colonists to Plymouth Colony, there were only 100 of them, and half of them died in the first few months of the colony. Here we have 15,000 colonists arriving in the space of just 10 years. And when they arrived, they started having children at an incredible clip. Married couples in Massachusetts Bay were on average having 8 children over the course of their reproductive lives. And shortly, as a result of these trends, the English regionally had a larger population than any of the area's individual tribes. Then, in the Pequot War of 1636 and 37, the colonies of Connecticut and Massachusetts, backed by the Narragansetts and Mohegans, devastated the Pequot people, who you see right here on the map, massacring hundreds of them and selling most of the survivors into slavery, including overseas. Cape and Island Wampanoags, despite their long history of opposing the English, took measure of these events and decided it was time to ally with these dangerous ascendant people. And their answer was to permit small English settlements and to begin hosting Christian missionaries, decisions which I think require some explanation. Let me emphasize here that in selling land to the English and in permitting them to forge small settlements in Wampanoag country, the Wampanoags certainly didn't anticipate that this would lead to their own dispossession. Why would they? First of all, this is important to remember, the initial English settlements were small, usually amounting to fewer than 100 people. Secondly, and this is a critical point as well, the Wampanoags did not see their land cessions to the English as giving the English exclusive and permanent ownership of that land, nor did they see these cessions as transferring jurisdiction over the people on the land from the Wampanoags to the English governments. Rather, they've envisioned these deals as the English buying into Wampanoag society with all of its mutual obligations. So let me reemphasize the point. Wampanoag people saw these land sales not as the English buying the land from under the Wampanoags, but rather as the English buying into Wampanoag society. The same would have gone if the Wampanoags had crossed the ocean and bought land in England, right? They would be buying into English society. Let me give you some examples of this thought process in motion. After the English bought Billingsgate through several transactions with different Wampanoag stakeholders, which itself was a strange kind of orientation for the English, that more than one person could have claims to the land. But after this, the Nauset Wampanoags, as natural inhabitants of the place, that was certainly their statement, reserved the rights in writing to collect shellfish, carve up drift whales, and plant on Poached Island and another neck of land. They held the English responsible to fence in Wampanoag land so that English livestock wouldn't trespass on it. Likewise, in one of the first deals for Barnstable, the English were obligated to fence in and plow the sachem Nepoyatum's land. They were obligated to build the sachem a house with floorboards, a chimney, and an oven. This leader, this chief or sachem, Nepoyatum, reserved the right for him and his people to gather wood and spend the winter wherever they pleased. What we're seeing here then is that the Wampanoag expectation was that these land deals would make the English a means of long-term Wampanoag benefit. Now, as I mentioned, Christian evangelization accompanied the spread of English settlements on the Cape and Islands. Too often, this missionary campaign on the Cape and Islands is overshadowed by the activity of the Roxbury, Massachusetts missionary John Eliot, but he's just one of a number of missionaries active during this period. The Mayhew family of the Vineyard, and 4 generations of them served as missionaries to the Wampanoags, began the process in the region, and they're soon followed by numerous others. William Leverage, Richard Bourne, and Thomas Tupper on the Cape. Bourne's and Tupper's descendants also served as missionaries. Peter Folger, the grandfather of Benjamin Franklin, was a missionary on Nantucket. John Cotton Jr., the son of the famous Boston minister, began his missionary career on the Vineyard, then relocated to Plymouth and began evangelizing Native people throughout the area. Eventually, Samuel Treat of Eastham became active on the Outer Cape. In all of this, the missionary instruction took place in Wampanoag communities, in the Wampanoag language, which these missionaries generally learned, and always, let me emphasize, with the assistance of Wampanoag people themselves. Indeed, I think too often we attribute the spread of Christianity to the English, when in fact, missionization depended on an increasingly long roster of Wampanoag missionaries. They included Papmunnock, Watunamatuck, Mishawan, and Tom Koshog on Cape Cod. By the 1690s, there were 37 Wampanoag preachers and 7 or 8 English preachers active in Wampanoag country. Never mind the dozens of native deacons and teachers. In other words, Christian missionary work was very much a Wampanoag enterprise to Wampanoag people. And how could it not be? Wampanoags were indispensable at translating and transmitting the Christian message in ways that resonated with their own traditions. So what I'm saying here is that though the mission certainly reflected English influence and the English ascendance in the region, they weren't yet a sign of colonial dominance. For the meantime, Christian Wampanoags remained in charge of their own destiny. Now, some Native people gave Christianity a hearing because they suspected that the colonists' relative good health and military success was a reflection of their spiritual power. No one, by the way, understood the communicability of disease during this period of time. Both parties, Native and English, attributed health or poor health to the spirits. Wampanoags routinely asked their missionaries to help heal the sick and inquired about Christianity's power to ward off and cure epidemic disease. For example, that Mashpee Wampanoag missionary named Watunamatuck recounted in 1665 that after 3 of his children, 3, had died in just 1 year, and I quote, "I thought God was angry at me." That's how he explained how he entered the church community. Another Mashpee named Wampum also recalled, and I quote, "I thought of my father that his gods could not deliver him from death, but this God could." Such ideas in the midst of what can only be called a decades-long Wampanoag health crisis provided ample motivation for Native people to explore the colonist religion, because colonists, by and large, were not dying of the epidemics that were so devastating Native people. Native people also hosted missionaries to diffuse the colonists' aggression when war loomed constantly. We very often characterize the period between 1620 and 1675 as one of peace. It was at best an uneasy peace, punctuated by constant war scares. One of missionary John Eliot's charges told him directly, this is a Native person, told him that he first gave Christianity a chance because, and I quote, "Sometimes I thought if we did not pray, the English might kill us." Now, let me emphasize here, the English didn't make these threats directly. They didn't propagate Christianity at gunpoint. There was no need. No one could mistake that colonists were more peaceful towards Christian Indians and more hostile towards non-Christians. Now, the missions also came with many practical benefits for Native people that reinforced their political calculations. Missionaries dispersed coveted goods like tools, metal tools, and blankets to their hearers. Wampanoags who served in the offices of preacher, church elder, or school teacher drew coveted salaries from the New England Company, a London-based organization which sponsored the missions. Christian schools run initially by English missionaries, but eventually by Native instructors, taught literacy in the Wampanoag language to a wide range of children and adults. That's why we have this slide, which this is a page from the first Bible ever published in North America. It's in the Wampanoag language. And what you're seeing here is marginalia by Wampanoag people responding to biblical passages. These are just incredible, incredible sources. Now, Christianity also offered the Wampanoags the protection of some of their territory from English encroachment. Everyone could plainly see that these missions would fail if the English totally displaced Native people who were interested in Christianity. Unfortunately, Native people living cheek by jowl by the English made up a disproportionate number of the Christians, and they faced the imminent danger of displacement at colonial hands. One answer was to create what contemporaries called praying towns. These were communities in which colonial governments guaranteed the land to Christian Indians forever. Now, in general, these praying towns were not new creations. Instead, they involved an existing community declaring itself to be Christian, submitting itself, at least formally, to colonial authority, and not least of all, very often agreeing to a land cession somewhere else. The best known of these praying towns, say like Natick, were in Massachusetts near Boston. But oft overlooked is that there were two praying towns in Wampanoag country. The first was Mashpee on Cape Cod. And what you're seeing here is a drawing of Mashpee by its minister sometime later in 1785. Mashpee was named a praying town in 1665 when the sachems Wepquish and Tukenchosin granted the area around Mashpee Pond, the Santuit River, and Wacoyet Bay to the local Indians forever, and not to be sold or given away from them by anyone without all their consents. So the grant went. The missionary Richard Bourne, after whom the famous or infamous bridge is named, often receives credit for the creation of Mashpee Praying Town because he filed the paperwork. I need to offer a correction that it was his own land speculation that contributed to the emergency that made a reservation necessary in the first place. The same went for the Mayhews on Martha's Vineyard, where they created a praying town aptly named Christian Town. Their own land speculation created an emergency that led to the creation of a bounded reservation. These developments help to explain both why the Cape Wampanoags did not fight against the English during King Philip's War and why other Wampanoags did. When the paramount Wampanoag sachem Pometacom, or King Philip, he's the son of Usamiquin or Massasoit, when he explained his numerous reasons for going to war with the English, among them was that the Christian mission had separated some of his followers from him, particularly those on Cape Cod and the islands. Sachems who had a regional profile, who had regional authority, in other words, sachems like Pometacom or King Philip, were universally opposed to the Christian mission because Christian Indians routinely used English protection to halt their tribute payments to these regional leaders. So in other words, the English are a wedge to manage tribal politics. Now, to be sure, Christian Wampanoags on the Cape and Islands shared some of their mainland kin's grievances against the English. Trespass by livestock on Indian cornfields and clam banks was a constant grievance. They also resented the creeping jurisdiction of English courts, for reasons that will be clear shortly. Yet, the colonial population on Cape Cod and the islands was too small in 1675 to represent a major threat. Whereas the English population between Massachusetts Bay and Narragansett Bay had already grown so large that they were placing acute pressure on Native people. And thus, when the war broke, Cape and Island Wampanoags tried to stay out of it. And yet they soon discovered, like many other Native people in the region, that there was no neutrality in this war. Repeatedly, English colonists treated Native communities that refused to take up arms in support of the colonies as enemies in wait, as a fifth column. In the case of praying Indians near Boston, the English forced them into a concentration camp on Deer Island, out in the middle of Boston Harbor, where they were exposed to winter weather and suffered starvation. And so Cape and Island Wampanoags, facing this choice, had to decide what to do. If they had decided to enter the war on the side of Native people in resistance, they could have easily dispatched the English of the Cape and Islands. They were much more numerous than local colonists. But regionally, the English had become much more powerful than Native people. And thus, if Cape and Island Wampanoags had struck local English settlements, it only would have been a matter of time before the English from other parts of New England would have destroyed them. Knowing this, Wampanoags from throughout the Cape served alongside the English during the war. Indeed, they suffered numerous casualties fighting on the English side, and colonial commanders judged their role in this war to have been indispensable to the English victory. Likewise, Vineyard Wampanoags guarded the island throughout the war and prevented Native refugees from the mainland from fleeing there during the war's dying days. This service by Cape and Island Wampanoags on the side of the English must have been utterly gut-wrenching. After all, many of the Native people in resistance were their kin. But their decision to side with the English, like their adoption of Christianity, goes a long way to explaining why the communities of Mashpee and Aquinnah still exist. Without major concessions to colonialism, Indigenous people in America didn't survive. Tragic endings tend to be much more appealing to storytellers than to the people who have to experience them. So they made a gut-wrenching, torturous decision at this moment so that future generations of their kin could live. Despite drawing praise from English elites for their military service, religiosity, and even civility, Christian Indians tended to attract racial resentment and even hostility from colonists of lesser status, particularly after the war, as you might imagine. The vineyard missionary Experience Mayhew complained in the 1720s that too many colonists rejected the possibility of there being, and I quote, sincere religion or godliness among this poor Indian people. He conceded that there were some vicious Indians, as he called them, just as assuredly as there were some vicious English people. But he said that was no reason, and I quote, to judge and condemn them all for the miscarriages of some among them. They are no worse by nature than others, or we ourselves. Indeed, he published this book here, which contains the biographies of 127 Christian Wampanoags to emphasize the point. He boasted that there were, and I quote, a considerable number of godly people among them. And yet Experience Mayhew and others like him were spitting into the wind. His English neighbors didn't want to respect Native people as fellow Christians because they knew what would come next. They would feel pressure to treat Native people with dignity. Instead, colonial society systematically exploited its post-war advantage in population and power to drive Native people into debt and seize their land, labor, and autonomy. Colonists turned what the Wampanoags had intended as joint use agreements into fee simple sales, giving colonists exclusive access to and jurisdiction over the land. When the war was over, suddenly the English began to deny Native people access to the fish runs, reed grasses, timber, and hunting grounds they needed to feed and clothe themselves, all the while destroying many of the resources that were left through the building of dams, overcutting the woods, and grazing countless horses, cattle, hogs, sheep, and goats on shoreline grasses. Give you an example of what I'm talking about. In 1680, Eastham prohibited the Nauset Wampanoags from gathering pine knots and tar and cutting woods on the town commons, even though the Wampanoags had done so customarily for decades. 30 years later, Eastham also denied the Wampanoags access to, and I quote, some particular swamps for the peeling of bark, leaving the natives fearful, as they put it, that we should be cut off and deprived of all the benefits of the land and hindered from living by the water, which they depended on for access to shellfish and saltwater fish. The Nauset Wampanoags like to think of themselves as the friends and co-religionists of their English neighbors, but these ordeals led them to conclude, as they said in a petition, that we are a distressed, despised people. And this is just one of many such complaints that echoed from all corners of Wampanoag territory during this period. Native people tried to make up the difference for the land that the English had seized from them and the resources that the English were destroying by buying food, clothing, and tools from English merchants. But invariably, they fell behind in their payments and soon found themselves facing their creditors in court, where the costs of the proceedings were themselves prohibitive. Wampanoags who lived on reservations like Mashpee or the small reservation Indian Town in Yarmouth had the best chances of weathering these crises because the law was supposed to prevent them from selling their land to pay off such debts. But those who lived outside of such reservations had no choice but to sell the land in order to keep their creditors at bay. And that pressure allowed colonists to pick apart Wampanoag communities like Nauset, Petonomicut, Monomoyet, and Setauket until there was hardly any acreage in these places left by the mid-18th century. The hurt was profound. Colonial expansion, after all, denied the Wampanoags access to sites where they had buried their loved ones, where their history had unfolded, where they had hunted, fished, and gathered and danced since time immemorial. The Wampanoags knew the names of and characteristics of every plant, animal, run of water, and hill in these places. They believed that the Creator had birthed their people into this homeland to live there in perpetuity. And so let's consider for a moment the strident terms that Mashpee Wampanoags used in this 1752 Wampanoag language petition protesting an English trespass. They declared, I'm going to quote this at length, "This Indian land, this was conveyed to us by these former sachems of ours. We shall not give it away, nor shall it be sold, nor shall it be lent, but we shall use it as long as we live, we, together with our children and our children's children, and all our descendants, and together with all their descendants. They shall always use it for as long as Christian Indians live. We shall use it forever and ever. Against our will, these Englishmen take away from us what was our land. They parcel it out to each other, and the marsh along with it, against our will. And as for our streams, they do not allow us peacefully to be when we peacefully go fishing. They beat us greatly, and they have houses on our land against our will. Truly, we think it is this: we poor Indians soon shall not have any place to reside, together with our poor children, because these Englishmen trouble us very much in this place of ours." Even today, Wampanoag people diagnosed with depression commonly struggle with a feeling of helplessness as white society cuts them off from their territory, only to ruin it through overdevelopment and pollution. It's a legacy centuries old. And seizing native land was only the half of it. White creditors, courts, ship merchants, and farmers also exploited native debts and their own control over the levers of government to seize native labor. The courts, Plymouth County, Barnstable County, and indeed almost every single county in southern New England, began sentencing indigenous people found guilty of criminal offenses and who were unable to pay their fines to periods of servitude that ran, and you can average them out, several times longer than those meted out to white criminals. The terms routinely lasted many years, and in a few cases even resulted in lifetimes of slavery. The crimes were sometimes trivial, such as joyriding a horse, and doubtless many of them were made up. But justice for Wampanoag people was practically impossible in post-war New England. Why? Well, Nantucket Wampanoag said that both judges and jurors are parties to the cause. In other words, the creditor is a local Englishman, the judge is probably his cousin or a neighbor, any juror is going to be made up of local Englishmen, and none of them were going to take Native people's side in these issues. The same went for suits for debt. When Wampanoag people's creditors filed lawsuits against them, the problem only grew worse because court costs, jail charges, and you could be jailed for debt then, and penalties sometimes doubled or tripled the cost of the original debt. Unless the native debtor had land to sell, the court would routinely sentence him or her to servitude until all the bills were paid. Despite contracts stipulating the length of service, authorities routinely added on time whenever servants got into trouble or became pregnant. So obviously, such penalties extending the time of these contracts encouraged some masters to invent charges of misbehavior or to sexually exploit their subordinates. In every which way, this system, and it was a system, was a trap. It even targeted Wampanoag children. Sometimes young Wampanoags wound up as servants simply by accompanying their bound mothers or fathers into service, usually their mothers. In most cases, though, it was the parents themselves who sold the children into servitude in what cannot be called a choice. They did so because they could see no other way. Sometimes sacrificing one child to creditors was the only way to keep the parents free and earning money so the rest of their children didn't wind up as servants too. Still, another factor was that so many Indian families were in disarray because of this pattern of what we might call judicial slavery, that there were no family and friends to help care for one's children in times of desperation. I can only characterize this dilemma as a nightmare. Take, for example, Joseph Quaison of Monomoic, who was born in 1698 and lived with his parents for his first 6 years. Then he recalled, "My father died £5 in debt to Mr. Samuel Sturges of Yarmouth. I was bound out to him by my mother on that account." Quaison remained the servant of one Englishman or another until well after he had become a grown man. Likewise, in 1728, Gershom Barnabas, a Wampanoag of Mashpee, not only agreed to perform 3 years of whaling for John Otis himself, but indentured, and I quote from the court documents, his 2 children, namely Moses Barnabas, a boy of about 5 years old last August, and a girl named Jerusha of about 3 years old. Moses to serve until age 21, Jerusha until 18. In exchange, he got 15 pounds to reduce his debt. This money might have kept him and his wife out of bound service, and it kept open the slim possibility of him earning enough while he was whaling to buy back his tiny children's freedom. But imagine the heartbreak experienced by this family and countless others who suffered similar ordeals. The missionary Gideon Hawley, the fellow who made that drawing of Mashpee that I showed you earlier, recalled that when he first arrived at his post in Mashpee in 1757, he was shocked to discover that, and I quote, "Every Indian had his master. Their children were sold or bound as security for the payment of their father's debts as soon as they were 7 or 8 years old, which 2 justices of the peace, with the consent of the parents, was easily obtained. And they were authorized to do at the desire of their creditors." He continued, "These Indians and their children were transferred from one another master like slaves." And this is a pattern that lasted from the late 1600s to the early 1800s. Earnings from whaling and fishing, and to a lesser extent, soldiering, provided the best opportunities for Wampanoag men to keep their families out of indentured service. It's no coincidence that one of the characters in Melville's 1851 whaling adventure, Moby Dick, is Tashtego, a Wampanoag harpooner from Gayhead on the Vineyard. Demand for native soldiers grew in lockstep with the development of the whaling industry in southern New England. England was at war with France in North America on and off from 1688 through 1763. And overlapping and often outlasting these conflicts were wars between the colony of Massachusetts and the Wabanaki people of Maine. And in those wars in the Maine theater, the Bay Colony often employed semi-independent Indian Ranger companies composed largely of Wampanoags. Then came the Revolution and the War of 1812, which mobilized all of American society, including Wampanoags. The cumulative effect of these wars on Wampanoag life was dramatic. By one count, New England Indians, and Wampanoags in particular, served at twice the rate of their English neighbors during these campaigns. Indeed, the Wampanoag community of Mashpee volunteered a higher percentage of their young men in the American Revolution than any other community in Massachusetts. Decent pay partly accounts for the high rate of Indian participation in maritime work and soldiering, but only partly. Rather, white people who controlled Wampanoag debts or indentures usually compelled Native people to do this work. By one count, 3/4 of all Wampanoags who served on Nantucket whaling crews during the 1720s and 30s were servants, whose earnings went directly to English masters. Sometimes merchants and authorities conspired to swindle hopelessly indebted mariners into using their children's freedom as collateral on the gamble of a whaling share. Think of the Barnabas family I mentioned earlier. As that missionary Gideon Hawley explained it, first the father is forced to go whaling, the boys are put up as sureties. When whaling fails to pay the debt, the boys are given up. And he might have added, the father commits to go to sea again. Military service was no different. The best study of this issue finds that half or more Native people in military service were indentured servants, which is 7 or 8 times the rate of colonial soldiers. Most of the rest of Wampanoag soldiers were technically free, but had accumulated such unmanageable debts that they were beholden to their creditors too. And too often, these colonial lenders or their relatives were the very Englishmen who led the natives' military companies and served as their guardians. Take, for example, Richard Bourne, a descendant of the missionary to the Mashpee Wampanoags by the same name. He raised more than 1/4 of his 100-man Wampanoag force in 1724 just by calling in his or his family members' accounts. And such patterns of debt-driven maritime or military service meant that for most Wampanoag men, life involved shuffling constantly between the military and whaling in alternate seasons throughout their whole adult lives. In other words, they were performing the most dangerous, brute work for the benefit of the very society that exploited them. Now, one reason that white colonists were able to exploit Wampanoag people with such impunity was that their population continued to grow by leaps and bounds while native numbers plummeted. Massachusetts had expanded to almost 250,000 people by the eve of the American Revolution, with native people representing barely 1% of that figure. Even on just the Cape and Islands, the non-native and overwhelmingly white population of nearly 23,000 people in 1776 dwarfed that of the Wampanoags by a factor of at least 10. The Wampanoag population was dropping in part because Wampanoag men tended to live short lives because of their perilous work as whalers, fishermen, and soldiers. Furthermore, and not to be overlooked, the wide-ranging travel of Wampanoag mariners and soldiers, and the labor of other Wampanoag people in port towns with international traffic exposed the Wampanoags to an endless succession of deadly diseases that ground down their already thin populations. In 1730, smallpox decimated the Wampanoags of Monomoyuk, and I quote from one account, so that there was scarce any grown person of the Indians left in this town. 6 years later, another smallpox epidemic killed up to half of the Yarmouth Wampanoags, while in 1738, an unnamed sickness carried off large numbers of people at Mashpee. The worst case on record from this period was an outbreak of yellow fever in 1763 and 64, which slayed more than 200 Wampanoags on Nantucket, including nearly all of the adults, plus some 39 on Chappaquiddick, and an unknown number at Mashpee. In the American Revolution, 25 of the 26 Mashpee men who served in one of the regiments of Barnstable died before returning home. And the one who did survive brought back with him a disease that claimed the lives of 70 people from a community of less than 300. Clearly, this was a demographic crisis by any measure. Some Native communities disintegrated under this strain, and it would have been a wonder if they hadn't. But others persevered. Mashpee on the Cape and Aquina and Christiantown on the Vineyard, for instance, survived in part because they were reservations protected by the law. But that wasn't the only reason. The Wampanoag people themselves, were relentless in protecting their land from the corruption of their guardians and their rapacious white neighbors. To address the shortage of men, the women married outsiders and integrated them into the community. But to ensure that white outsiders continued to recognize that these were still Indian places, Wampanoag women took a more public-facing role in leadership than ever before when it came to such things as petitioning Boston or meeting with outside officials. They cultivated powerful, well-connected white people like lawyers and missionaries to defend their interests and watched them closely to guard against graft. Sometimes they took more forcible measures, as in the 1830s, when the Mashpee Wampanoags seized back control of their meeting house from an indifferent white minister and forcibly put an end to white poaching on their woodlands. When Barnstable County responded by arresting the ringleaders, one of them, the minister William Apis, pictured here, launched a public relations campaign in which he castigated the white people of Massachusetts for the hypocrisy of their abuse of local indigenous people, even as they widely criticized President Andrew Jackson for his Indian removal policies in the South. Afterward, the Commonwealth awarded Mashpee with a greater degree of home rule. Yet it was never enough. The so-called Mashpee Revolt had the unintended effect of awakening white Massachusetts authorities to its anomalous condition, in which Wampanoag people were state subjects, but without citizenship. Then, the era of Southern Reconstruction in the 1860s finally galvanized white officials to grant New England's Indian population the same rights that New Englanders were fighting to extend to freed Black people in the South. Hardly anyone in a position of authority would consider that whereas former slaves considered equality under the law to be justice, most indigenous people saw being brought under white law as an imposed mechanism of colonial dispossession. The process involved dividing the reservations of the Wampanoag people into private property tracts, giving Mashpee and Gayhead the status of towns, annexing the smaller former reservations to white majority towns, and declaring all of the indigenous people to be full-fledged citizens and no longer Indians, as if these two things were antithetical. Some white proponents of this measure, at their more honest moments, admitted that they thought of it as just the final step in a natural process of Indian extinction in the face of white superiority. What we're hearing here is a New England iteration of the national white supremacist ideology of manifest destiny. More than just a matter of justice, they considered the Wampanoags to be too racially intermixed and adapted to white ways to be classified as Indians any longer. Indians were supposed to remain a people frozen in some kind of Stone Age existence. These white officials, convinced as they were that it was the fate of Indians to vanish, defined any changes that Native people had made to survive as steps towards extinction. The fight has continued to this very day. The Wampanoags of Mashpee and Aquinnah effectively morphed their tribes with their new towns and maintained control of these communities well into the 1960s, even after most of the land titles had formally passed on to whites. When the Wampanoags began to lose control of these towns with the post-World War II influx of outsiders, they fought for and obtained recognition from the federal government as tribes, entitled to reservations, programming money, and perhaps most importantly, a stronger measure of sovereignty over their cultural, economic, and political direction. That sovereignty, I should note, has included a revival of the Wampanoag language, a development so profound that I suspect that historians will be studying it centuries from now. The Trump administration's recent removal of Mashpee's land from federal trust will hopefully be temporary and a soon reverse setback. But it should serve as a poignant reminder that for Indigenous people, including the Wampanoags, the colonial era didn't end in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. It continues. It continues as long as they have to battle for their land and autonomy. And even Cape Cod is no refuge from that fight. That fight is basic to what it means to live in the United States. Thank you.